This is Force for Hire,
a deep dive into private military contracting and how it's transforming the battlefield.
I'm Michelle Harvin.
And I'm Desmond Ferris.
Kimberley Motley is truly one of a kind. She's not afraid to shake things up and loves a challenge. She's been working as an international attorney for over a decade, starting in Afghanistan, where she was the first Westerner to litigate in the Afghan courts. It's not for the legal faint of heart. Afghanistan has a reputation for being corrupt and routinely taking bribes. When she first got to the country, she saw how many foreigners lined the Afghan prisons, many of them private contractors who got caught up in the system. Motley saw a business opportunity and a need, so she's been fighting ever since. And as you've probably guessed, she's a verifiable badass. I talked with her about the cases that made her career as a defender of private contractors, what it's like battling inside the Afghan courts, and her advice to contractors on how to stay out of them. One thing to note in our conversation, Motley mistakenly identifies the then president as President Ghani, who is the current president. At the time, it was President Hamid Karzai. We started the conversation talking about what brought a former beauty queen who never left the country to Afghanistan.
When I was a public defender in 2008, I was sort of looking for another position, just again, casually. And so my friend told me about her friend who was overseas in Afghanistan, capacity building the rule of law program and training and mentoring Afghan defense attorneys. I was like, oh, that sounds cool. Can you give me his email? She gave me his email, and I just sent him a blind email, basically said, what you're doing sounds cool. Here's my resume in case you're interested. 2 weeks later, I get a call from Afghanistan for like an impromptu interview where and they called me from Afghanistan for the position. It's funny because I didn't even look. I still to this day have not even looked the position up. So I had no idea what the position entailed, if they were even hiring at that point in time. But shortly thereafter, I'd say about 3 months later, I was in Virginia training to go to Afghanistan. And then shortly thereafter, and it was my first time where I didn't even own a passport. So I had to get a passport. And then I went to Afghanistan in September 2008.
And so what did the job entail? What were you doing?
Well, basically, my whole thing of going there, to be honest, was for financial reasons. I was told that the job would be making more than triple my current salary. And with student loans and 3 children, it was very attractive. And so I thought I'd go there for a year, make money, then come back to the U.S. So basically what the job entailed was training and mentoring Afghan defense attorneys. There's an advocates law, which is part of their criminal defense attorneys that was just enacted. I believe it was 2004. And so criminal defense attorneys was basically, they call them advocates over there, but advocates or criminal defense attorneys was a relatively new concept. So they wanted someone to come work within the Ministry of Justice which is akin to our public defender system in the U.S., to sort of train up those lawyers, help to sort of provide support to the Ministry of Justice, public defender bar, and also to train and mentor private Afghan defense attorneys.
And I read somewhere that you said you went there for a business opportunity, but it became something else. What did it become?
Well, it was really interesting because when I went there, I had zero international experience. And so I really wanted to understand not just the laws on paper, but to see how they worked in practice. And so part of what I did is I thought it'd be a great idea to go, sit in court hearings. I went to various prisons and I sort of listened to, it was a lot of listening and observing, listening to a lot of people that were locked up within the Afghan prisons throughout the country. And what was really interesting is that when I went to Pol-i-Charkhi prison in Kabul, which is Afghanistan's largest prison, I went there for a tour, again, to really understand the legal system. And I was really surprised at, frankly, the conditions of the prison. But also I was surprised to meet foreigners that were locked up in Pol-i-Charkhi prison. Foreign prisoners from Africa, from the UK, from Australia, from frankly, all over the world. It didn't really dawn on me that there were foreigners that were also locked up, English-speaking foreigners that were also locked up in Afghanistan. And sort of after talking to them, listening to their stories, understanding how they really didn't have legal representation. They weren't given a translator, hearing stories about torture and abuse. And also combined with my personal sort of ambitions where I'm a trial attorney. So I was really missing going to court. I was really missing representing people. I decided to quit my job as this capacity builder with the program that originally brought me to Afghanistan. And in 2009, I quit that job that was funded by the U.S. State Department, and I decided to start representing people. And in the beginning, I was only exclusively representing foreigners that were doing business in Afghanistan or foreigners who were locked up in Afghanistan.
And so some of these foreigners were private security contractors. Is that right?
Correct.
And so what were some of their stories? How did they get caught up in the system?
Well, I mean, for many of these guys, they were ex-military men. Pretty much, I would say at least 90% of them had some military experience, and they were working for a private security firm of some sort. And so some of them were in for, like I represented someone that was in for bribery, Anthony Malone, who was a former British soldier. Bevan Campbell, former British soldier in South Africa, represented him for drug possession. Robert Langdon from Australia, Philip Young from South Africa. They're both also ex-military personnel, represented both of them for murder. There were several people in the U.S. who I represented for weapons violation, for like supposedly not having the proper documentation for weapons. Gun smuggling. It was a wide variety of different cases I was representing people for. So there wasn't like one exclusive type of case that I was representing them for, but it was mostly for criminal defense work.
And was there something that made private security contractors especially vulnerable?
There's a couple things. Number one, at the time when then President Ghani was basically not too in favor of private security contractors. He was sort of concerned as how they were behaving in the country, and he was really cracking down on them. And so with him cracking down on them by putting different security companies on blacklists, but Afghan law enforcement was taking the guns and vehicles and radios of private security contractors that they would see working out in the field, because you have to transport your clientele throughout the country. And so the Afghan police were like stopping these private security contractors who were in these vehicles and taking the vehicles, basically saying that they didn't have the proper documentation, which is completely ridiculous, because there was no really proper way to register vehicles or proper way to register weapons. They sort of kept the government, in my opinion, often kept private security companies in sort of this gray area where they could choose to, confiscate material and weapons and vehicles from them. And what would often happen is they would take these cars from private security contractors, citing that they didn't have the right documentation. And because a lot of these cars have trackers, then the companies would see the car sort of being, driven around by different people within the Afghan government. They would never be able to often they would never be able to return these. They would never be able to get the vehicles or the weapons back from the government. And so the government was sort of shopping. I called it shopping, where they were taking the vehicles and then giving it to Afghan governmental officials to use.
And then they would lock up the people who they took stuff from?
Sometimes they would. They would lock them up. And like, for instance, my first big case involved representing Bill Shaw, who was a former British soldier. He had an OBE, very well-decorated military man from the UK. And so he was working for G4S at the time. He was in a 2-car convoy, and basically the government stopped the 2-car convoy and confiscated the vehicles, the weapons, and the radios during this whole thing. And so Bill was trying, and G4S is also the contracting company that would provide the security for the British embassy in Afghanistan. So he was trying to understand why they took the vehicles. And so he wanted to pay the vehicle confiscation fee. Like, if you impound your car in the US, you have to pay to get it back. And so he was continually going to the police and saying, how much is it? How much is it? Was sharing the fact that he was going to the police to pay the confiscation fee with the British embassy. So they were all in the picture. And finally, he was told that in order to get the vehicles back, it would cost, I believe it was $75,000. And so he went there to get the $75,000, to give them the $75,000 to their offices and where the vehicles were being kept. In order to go in, you're like going through at least four armored gates where there's checkpoints at each gate. He paid the money. He asked for a receipt. They said they would give him a receipt, and then him and another guy were able to drive the vehicles out off the compound. So you can't just take those vehicles out, but they drove them off the compound. So they didn't give him a receipt that day, but they told him, okay, just come back, you'll get it. So he kept going back to get a receipt, actually for several months, until he connected with another guy, and the guy said, well, no, that's a bribe. And so they then locked him up for bribery.
And so what happened when you and Bill Shaw started working together?
Well, I started representing Bill, and basically we went to court for bribery. He was looking for 8 years prison. And so when we went to court, obviously the British embassy was involved. His company G4S was involved. And there was zero evidence to support the fact that he was intentionally trying to bribe the officials. There was a lot of evidence showing that he was trying to get a receipt, that he was trying to make this legal payment, and everyone was involved in terms of knowing that this is the steps that he took. So anyway, we went to first court, and I had all this, I had witnesses, I had, exhibits, I had, Bill Shaw testified. And basically the prosecutor, all he did was he stood up in court, he read the indictment, and he sat down. And that is all he did. Whereas I had all these witnesses and evidence and things and emails and whatnot that I had presented to the court. And at the end of it, he was found guilty of bribery and given 2 years in prison. And, it was horrible because he was not guilty of bribing anybody. So I remember after the court hearing, I go to the judges. I said, how could you have found him guilty of this? And he didn't do this. And the judges looked at me and they were confused. And they said, we gave him the minimum. And I'm like, what? Because the minimum was 2 years. So the charge carried a 2 to 8 year sentence. And I told the judge, I said, the minimum is not guilty. And so later I was to find out that in this court, no one had ever been found not guilty. So for them to give him 2 years in prison, in their eyes, that's a not guilty, and so they didn't know how to completely exonerate him. And so, Bill and I sort of connected the next day, and we talked about whether or not he wanted to appeal, and which I thought was a good idea. And ultimately we did appeal. We went to court 2 months later after the original sentence. So we went to court 2 months later, I pushed the appeal date. And basically the appeal hearing is another trial. So we had another trial. I sort of changed up my strategy a little bit. I adjusted it more to, the problem is that part of my first strategy in first court, I was being very American lawyerish, which is good. But I wasn't being enough Afghan lawyerish too. I wasn't sort of, sort of seasoning my legal practice with that flavor also, which I needed to do that. And it's interesting too, by the way, is that the night of when they reached the decision and gave him 2 years in prison, it was all in the Afghan media that they had found this foreigner guilty of bribery. And this shows that the court is not corrupt, because surely the foreigner tried to bribe. Surely, they would have tried to do something underhanded. So they were trying to prop it as this gave validity to the court. So we were going to lose from the beginning. That was pretty clear. And Bill sort of became this political pawn in a certain type of way. So anyway, we went to second court. We fought in second court, and he got a straight up not guilty in second court, and we won. And again, this was the first time in that court that anyone got a not guilty. He was given 0 prison time. It was a straight up not guilty, and he was released. And so that is what really sort of got the attention to me of other security contractors. So then I was just having all types of cases being thrown my way after that.
When we come back, we continue our conversation with Kimberley Motley.
Stay informed on all the news that matters most to the military community with a subscription to Stars and Stripes Digital Access. As a subscriber, you'll enjoy unlimited access to the Stripes.com website and our Stars and Stripes mobile apps, updated 24/7 by reporters stationed at military bases around the globe. Subscribe today and enter the promo code PODCAST when signing up for a yearly subscription and receive 50% off your first year. Get exclusive access to special features, interactive articles, award-winning photography, and more. Visit stripes.com/digital and enter the promo code PODCAST to subscribe today. There are particular challenges you've talked about working within the Afghan justice system. How do you adapt? How did you navigate working within this country?
Well, I mean, one of the main things that I had to sort of adjust to is that it is the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So what that means is Islamic law is the primary legal resource that a lawyer should use within Afghanistan. And that's something that obviously is completely different from the U.S., where there's a separation between church and state, but in Afghanistan, church is state. So you need to incorporate, if you want to be an effective litigator, effective lawyer there, you need to understand and be comfortable with citing from, for instance, the Holy Quran, in addition to citing from the laws that are on the book. So that was something that was very challenging for me and unfamiliar to me. But I had to, if I'm going to practice law there, I sort of came to the conclusion, if I'm going to practice law here, I need to do it the right way. Otherwise, I don't need to be here. So that was one thing that was very challenging. The second thing that was challenging is Afghanistan is a country where often, illegal cultural practice trumps written legal procedure. So, for instance, what I mean by that is there's a lot of cases that I actually observed where people were not being physically brought to court, and they may be locked up at the prison awaiting trial, and they weren't being physically brought to court, but yet judges were finding them guilty of crimes. So you had people that, and actually, a couple of the guys I met, that happened to them, where they were sitting in prison waiting for trial and were actually found guilty of whatever crime they were accused of. And then weeks later, they were told, oh, you got a 20-year sentence. And so this was something that had been going on for so long that no one really even challenged it. So that was something that was very different. And also another thing that was extremely challenging is it's no secret that Afghanistan is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And so I have an ethical practice, 100% ethical practice. I don't engage in corruption. I do not pay bribes. And so, but corruption and bribery is so embedded within the system. So often I'm fighting, I'm being approached by judges, sort of asking for a bribe. And I would have to tell them, no, I don't pay bribes, which is super uncomfortable. It's super ethical, but it's super uncomfortable to be asked by a presiding judge of a case that you are representing a client for a bribe, and you telling them, no, I don't do that. So I had to develop methods to sort of curtail that. And what I would do is after I'd have a meeting with the judge, I would put it in writing. I'd say, on this day, you asked me for money. I'm just asking for a fair trial. And that's one thing I've learned about corruption, is that corruption is often done in the dark and not in written form. So when I would do that, I saw judges be like, no, don't put this in writing. No. They didn't like that. But that was something that I did, and I would file it with the file. And I did that because that was sort of my way to checks and balance on them. if that makes sense. And I found that to be a real effective way to stop judges from really asking me for bribes. And I remember one time my translator was actually talking to a judge, and the judge goes to him in Dari, and he goes, "Do Americans pay bribes?" And my translator told him, "Not this one."
So with these security contractors, they're connected to a company, and most of the time these companies are doing government contracts. Is there any reason why they're getting maybe left behind and sort of caught up in legal cases that maybe a service member wouldn't?
Well, I mean, with the military personnel, they're under a different sort of legal structure. You're under the military legal structure, and also, frankly, the Afghan government, in my opinion, um, eh, wouldn't dare sort of mess with our military personnel as they would a private American who's over there working, because the military is so strong and has such a strong backing that it just would frankly probably embarrass the Afghan government in a lot of ways if that happened. If they were to go after just military personnel. So they're operating under different rules and different sort of treaties and whatnot. But with private security companies, they're to abide by local, and same as military personnel, they're also supposed to abide by local laws of Afghanistan. But the thing about it is most military personnel, not all, but most, are sort of housed and stay on bases. So it's difficult for Afghan police officers to come on the base. Like, you can't just walk onto a military base. Whereas the security contractors, they're working, what people call in the field. So they're working out in the community. They're working usually not on military bases. And so because of that, they are more susceptible to being in interaction with police and being under a bigger microscope, more of a microscope, if they don't follow Afghan laws.
And you work with a lot of different cases. You don't just work with security contractors, but what makes those security contract cases challenging, or ones that you wanted to actually take on?
Well, what makes security contractors a sort of difficult cases, especially if they're a security contractor from a country that's not Afghanistan, is there's this added political layer. So, for instance, like I said, a lot of my guys are from like America, Australia, the UK. So sometimes they just target, or at that point in time, there was an argument to be made that they were sort of targeting different people from different countries to use them as political leverage. I mean, maybe there's an Afghan, high up political Afghan that's locked up in their country, in whatever other country, and they want to lock somebody up from the UK as leverage to negotiate, getting that person out. Or sometimes what I've seen, a British person may be locked up, or American person may be locked up, and some people may try to ask for more funding for the country. Things like that were happening. And, the governments wouldn't budge at all. And so that's where sort of I came in. We're like, no, we have to litigate this the right way. So I was sort of having quite a bit of pushback, not just from the Afghans, but often from people from different countries, because they didn't understand that you have to fight this within the Afghan courts, and you have to use the Afghan laws. And so, which are somewhat, not completely, but somewhat different from, for instance, the laws of America or the laws of the UK. And so it was like sort of getting different countries to understand that. Also, for the vast majority foreigners I represent were men. And so it was very difficult for them to frankly understand that, they always want to throw in that male element. Oh, you have to have a man to represent. It should be a man representing. Obviously, I disagree with that. And frankly, there wasn't a man that would represent these security guys, because I was the first and only, and I think still only, foreigner that was litigating with the Afghan courts. And so, they sort of had this idea, the foreigners, not Afghans, but the foreigners, that, oh, you have to have a man to represent other men, which was a ridiculous way of thinking.
And this is dangerous work for you as well, not only as a woman, but just because what you're doing, and you are the first foreign litigator. What have you come up against in your work?
Well, I mean, with my work, I mean, I've gotten threats. I've been detained. I've had a grenade thrown at my office. It didn't go off, though. There's always threats to, clients are sort of, talked to about me representing them. There's a lot that goes on. So I give my clients, I have great clients, a lot of credit for allowing me to represent them. And, now it's been almost 11 years in, and I've successfully represented, all my clients for 11 years on criminal charges in Afghanistan. So I've been very, very fortunate. But, the thing about it is that the personal stuff is just personal stuff I have to deal with. So that's fine. That's not really for my clients to have to deal with, but it's an expected consequence, frankly. If you tell anybody, well, I'm practicing law in Afghanistan, of course I'm gonna get threats. Of course, I'm gonna be detained at some point. It's just life. But it's my job, period. And I love my job and I love my clients.
If you could give advice to security contractors who will be going overseas, what would you tell them?
Well, I would tell them to definitely educate themselves on the law. You don't have to become a lawyer, but at least like the basics, like with your job, you should know, for instance, if you're driving in a vehicle, you should know basic stuff. Like if you're riding in a vehicle, whether or not it's registered or not, you have a right to know whether or not the gun that you're carrying is legally registered in the country. You have a right to know if the radios that you're using are legally registered in the country, because these are things that if the government chooses to stop you or your vehicle, these are things that they're going to put on you, if they're not properly registered. I recommend for private security contractors to have 2 passports, because often what happens is if the police stop them or take them into custody, they will take the passport. And so often the people just have no ability to leave the country. But I recommend for everyone to have 2 passports, and you have a legal right to have 2 U.S. passports. And I just recommend people to, also respect and it's sort of a blanket thing, like just respect the culture. In terms of at least the laws of the culture. For instance, in Afghanistan, it is an Islamic country. So drinking is illegal throughout the country, whether you're Muslim or not. I can say that, they allow people to bring in alcohol, but it's again, a gray area, where they'll allow it, but at any point in time, they can say, no, you can't drink, and take the alcohol away. So I recommend if you're going to do that, just do it with discretion. Because I know it is available to people. And I just recommend people to really just be careful, just really be careful. Because, those are tough environments to work in, especially as private security contractors and especially as military personnel. They're very, very tough environments to work into. And I really give, especially my hats off to our military who's doing amazing work and frankly doesn't get as much credit as they deserve.
A huge thanks to Kimberley Motley for taking the time to talk with us. On the next episode, how private military companies are taking the helm on cybersecurity.
Well, I think most of it's handled by private companies and contractors. Most government departments and agencies don't do their own cybersecurity. They contract it out.
Don't forget to subscribe. And while you're there, leave us a review. You can also let us know your thoughts at podcast@stripes.com. Also, follow us on Twitter for updates at Stars and Stripes.
Force for Hire's supervising editors are Bob Reed and Terry Leonard. Digital team lead and editor is Michael Darnell.
Thanks for listening.
This is Force for Hire.